The UN's top court hears arguments about Israel's military campaign in Rafah. Israel states it has the right to defend itself against Hamas. South Africa says the offensive is aimed at wiping out Palestinians. But could any order by the World Court stop Israel? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. The International Court of Justice has met 4 times since Israel launched its war on Gaza in October, 3 at the request of South Africa. In its latest appeal, Pretoria has called for urgent measures to order a halt on the assault on Rafah. Since early this month, Israeli forces have been pounding the southern city, where more than 1.5 million Palestinians had taken shelter after escaping from other parts of Gaza. Hundreds of thousands are now being forced to flee again to refugee camps in central Gaza. Israel says its operation is limited and aimed at targeting the last stronghold of Hamas in Rafah. South Africa calls it a genocidal act. The ICJ has ordered some provisional measures since Pretoria first filed a case in January, but Israel has largely ignored them. So can the court enforce its orders, and will its decisions make any difference apart from affecting world opinion? We'll discuss these questions with our panel of experts in a few moments. But first, this report by Ibtisam Genford.
Preparing a symbol of peace outside the International Court of Justice, while inside, Israel defends its ground operations in Rafah. Israel is intensifying a full-scale offensive in the southern city, despite opposition from many of its allies. In the last 12 days, more than 640,000 people have fled Rafah, and Israel's military says it's deploying more ground troops there. Lawyers representing South Africa say the UN's top court must order extra measures to prevent acts of genocide.
It has become increasingly clear that Israel's actions in Rafah are part of the endgame. This is the last step in the destruction of Gaza and its Palestinian people.
This set of hearings is the 4th the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, has held on Israel's treatment of Palestinians since the start of its war on Gaza in October. The first was in January, also launched by South Africa. The court had ordered provisional measures demanding Israel do everything in its power to prevent genocidal acts. But Israel says its operation in Rafah isn't genocide, and the city is a Hamas stronghold. It accuses South Africa of operating on behalf of the Palestinian group.
It has a clear ulterior motive when it asks you to order Israel to stay away from Rafah. It does so in order to obtain military advantage for its ally, Hamas, which it does not wish to see defeated.
South Africa also accuses Israel of blocking aid from entering Gaza. UN officials say only a few aid trucks have entered through the Karim Abu Salim crossing in several days. And the US has admitted supplies starting to enter through a floating pier its military has built on Gaza's coast can't make up for what could be delivered by land.
The basic point is, will we be able to get enough aid in to keep people alive? We've made it very clear that unless things change dramatically for the better, the answer is no, and people will die.
Israel's representatives argue it's taking extraordinary measures to protect civilians. The court has given Israel until Saturday to show how it will ensure the safety of Palestinians fleeing to so-called safe zones, and says it will decide on possible additional measures to stop the Israeli assault in the next few weeks. Ibtisam Genford, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us by Skype from London is international human rights lawyer Toby Cadman. Nour is a political analyst who joins us by Skype from Ramallah. And Robbie Sabel is Professor of International Law at Hebrew University, and he's joining us from West Jerusalem. A very warm welcome to each of you. Mr. Cadman, I'll start with you in London. How do you assess the latest hearings at the International Court of Justice? South Africa's presentation, how strong was it, and Israel's defence?
Thank you. So I think it was a very strong response, or a very strong argument set forth by the South African delegation. Very much like the first one, I would say it was evidence-based, it was coherent, and it set out the position as many see it, and set out the necessity for the further indication of provisional measures. So I think it was a strong position that was set out. The Israeli delegation, they obviously complained that they had insufficient time to gather their legal team, and so there was a much smaller delegation of three that had come from the government. What I think from a disappointing side, I think there was the same kind of denials that we've seen in previous. Or certainly in the previous hearings, I think there was an inappropriate attack on the South African delegation as being the legal arm of a terrorist entity, which is not an appropriate argument to put forward before the court. But I think that the case, as it was presented by both sides, will cause the court some difficulty. Obviously, the main call is for a cessation of hostilities and a withdrawal of all armed units. I don't think we'll see the court go that far, but I think we will see them go a lot further than they have done in the previous provisional measures. Of course, the situation in Rafah is critical, and so I think they will have to take action.
Absolutely. Lots to pick up on there. Mr. Sabel, how do you assess Israel's defense that their operation in Rafah is to defeat Hamas? And what do you make of what Mr. Cadman had to say about the Israeli defense and, you know, the denials, he says, in Israel's defense and at times inappropriate?
I think there's two aspects here that worry us. The first is there was very little emphasis on Hamas. Hamas afterwards attacked Israel, killed deliberately over 1,000 civilians, and continue to send rockets into Israeli civilian towns. It's a terrorist organization. Its charter calls for the elimination of Israel, and there was very little reference to this. It was as if we were fighting the civilian population in Gaza, which we're not. We're fighting a terrorist organization. The other element that disturbs us is clearly there's been no genocide here. Even members of the court were not willing to say there was genocide or even a plausible, but they did a rather tenuous claim for jurisdiction that there was a plausible possibility of the civilian population having a right not to have genocide against them.
Yeah, but Mr. Sabel, why would the court rule that the Palestinians in Gaza have a right to protection against genocide unless there is a risk of genocide?
I think they wanted to have jurisdiction. But clearly there's no genocide, and clearly there's going to be no decision of genocide. But the court wanted to intervene. Obviously, the civilian population in Gaza has been very badly affected, heavy casualties. But this is because we're fighting in a built-up area. Any army person knows to fight against a terrorist organization in a built-up area is going to cause civilian casualties. And the court was justifiably worried about this and wants to try and protect the civilian population. But it did it by trying to attach jurisdiction to a genocide case, and this I don't think they should have done.
OK, Mr. Cadman, I can see that you don't agree with that, but let me bring Nour Odeh in here on the Israeli defense that the Israeli army is just trying to defeat Hamas. Even, questions about whether it's possible to defeat Hamas militarily aside, does that goal justify the deaths of already tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza? How do you think, the court is looking at this issue?
Well, Elizabeth, it absolutely does not justify what is happening, and that's what the Genocide Convention says. But what the Israeli team in The Hague and what defenders of this genocide want the world to believe want the world to do is to believe them and to not believe their eyes, to not believe the reports, to not believe the overwhelming outpouring of reports by experts on the subjects, leading world experts on the subject of genocide, who have said that this is a textbook case of genocide. And had the court not agreed, it wouldn't have accepted this case, and Israel wouldn't be, or should be at least, preparing to stand trial for genocide in the coming months. These hearings, we have to remind the viewers, are just on provisional measures. The subject matter of whether Israel will stand trial has already been dealt with. It will stand trial. And so the merits case, as it's referred to by lawyers, will proceed in the months ahead. But the evidence is overwhelming. Just as these proceedings were taking place, the World Food Programme was saying that Palestinians in Gaza, children and adults, were reducing to the size of skeletons and dying in agony. The United Nations was saying there was no more food to give. The crossings weren't allowing, Israel wasn't allowing aid into the crossings, certainly not enough, not from the north, certainly not from the south. Even the Americans were saying that much more needs to be done. So it's a bit difficult to sell an argument that wants you to discard all of that evidence and just believe the say-so of the Israeli representatives at The Hague.
And on the issue of evidence, Mr. Cadman, if I can bring you in, you know, I heard one international lawyer, Michael Link, who's the former special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory, he was saying that a good way to look at who has a stronger case in the latest hearings is who presented the more credible evidence to support what they're claiming, and how the South African team presented, you know, many reports from the United Nations, including about how famine is now taken hold in northern Gaza and how it's spreading. And he said that Israel couldn't do the same. Mr. Cadman, what will the judges be looking at in deciding their ruling in this latest hearing?
Well, first of all, just to go back to what the other guest has said, I don't think it's appropriate and I don't think it's right to say that the International Court of Justice somehow fudged jurisdiction in order to have the case. That's not how the International Court of Justice operates. They looked at the evidence that was presented and they concluded, as they have stated in a very clear ruling, that there is jurisdiction over this. And as we've heard from the other guest, that obviously we're not looking at the merits, the substance of the arguments yet. That's going to come much later. But I think that what has been presented by South Africa is a very strong case based on the evidence. I don't think it's justifiable to say that Israel is merely targeting Hamas. Of course, they are targeting Hamas, and of course, we mustn't forget what happened on the 7th of October. But of course, the ICJ doesn't have jurisdiction over Hamas because Hamas is not a state. So the South African case was based firmly on the evidence of what it has been unfolding in Gaza, and particularly what was planned for Rafah, and the statements that have been issued by leading members of the Israeli government, which are deeply disturbing, and really are demonstrative of what the intentions clearly are. And as you've said...
What do you think, Mr. Cadman, when you say that, what do you think their intentions clearly are?
So we can point to a number of different statements as to the effectively the raising of Gaza, moving Palestinians out, and we've heard this repeatedly since the middle of October. So I mean, I've stated it before. I think there are sufficient statements that have been made and sufficient conduct to demonstrate. And genocide is the crime of all crimes. It is the hardest charge to prove, but there is certainly a case to be argued that this is a genocide, and that is the intent. But just turning to the other point that you made in relation to famine, I mean, I think that's an important point to put. You know, using starvation as a weapon of war is a war crime. We've now heard a number of statements, and even Samantha Power, the chief of USAID, has stated this to Congress, that this is a famine unfolding. Yeah. And so I think And that's an independent voice. I mean, that's not a voice that has anything to gain, any axe to grind. That is an independent voice stating what is the current situation on the ground.
Yeah, given all of that international pressure, Mr. Sabel, how do you think Israel is going to respond? The International Court of Justice has given Israel until Saturday to show how it will ensure the safety of Palestinians, fleeing Rafah. How much pressure or further pressure is Israel under now, and how do you expect it to respond?
I think what we'll be doing is what we've done in the past, present the evidence of the hundreds of trucks that we've been allowing in, the fact that we don't, for Egypt can allow it in, we're now allowing it through shipping, and the fact that we've been urging the civilian population to move out of areas before we attack. That's not how you do genocide.
Yeah, Mr. Sabel, just 2 points about that. When you say the hundreds...
If I can continue on this point. It's not pleasant for people to move out, but it's saving their lives.
Well, it's not saving their lives when the United Nations, when various humanitarian organizations are saying that they are being killed when they are trying to flee, they are killed when they get to wherever they've been told to go to. And on the hundreds of trucks that you say Israel is allowing in, I mean, the United Nations has said that Gaza needs 500 trucks a day. That's very rarely happened since October 7th. You can probably count on one hand the number of times that's happened. So again, how is Israel going to respond to what the United Nations, to international humanitarian organizations and the United States, its biggest ally, is saying about things like the lack of aid and that Israel has no plan for the safe evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people in Rafah?
What the United States has said is they want us to present plans for evacuating the Rafah, and we're working on it. What we've done so far is when we've attacked in the north of Gaza, we moved the population out, and they were saved by this. And it's strange to accuse Israel of moving population out. Should we have attacked when the population was there? And the figures of casualties, I don't know if they're correct or not, but they don't include the Hamas terrorists. If you look at the figures, it's awfully strange. The only people who have been killed have been civilians. And in fact, the reality is that over 10,000 of them were terrorists who were killed in action. And they're continuing to fight.
But I wonder what your...
rockets. I had a rocket fired near my town.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what you're basing that 10,000... What are you basing that 10,000 Hamas... you say Hamas terrorists killed, because it's not just the US State Department, but it's even, publications like one of the world's most reliable medical journals, The Lancet, Human Rights Watch, use the figures by Hamas's health ministry for the casualties, including the number of women, children and elderly, which make up 60%. Ms. Odeh, let me bring you in on what you're hearing so far about the pressure on Israel to respond.
Well, to be honest, I don't think that Israel has really felt enough pressure to respond in the way most of the world wants it to, which is to stop the mass slaughter of Palestinian civilians. The evidence is overwhelming. And we just heard in the past 24 hours from the Palestinian Red Crescent that 40% of the people they've treated in the past days have been people who were forced to evacuate to what Israel calls safe areas. And what are those safe areas? They are either sand dunes, the area that is called Al-Mawasi, no infrastructure, no water, no food, no medical services, or Khan Yunis, which has been reduced to rubble and turned into a mass grave where children, women, and medical staff were found bound, tortured, and executed. So there isn't the kind of pressure that you would expect is not present. I think the American administration is finding it harder and harder to justify where it stands on this, but it still has its eye on November and is trying, I think, in many ways to balance between holding on to the support of its base, that overwhelmingly wants this war to stop, and also trying to not upset the traditional elements of the Democratic Party, who are the donors of the Biden administration's re-election campaign. In all, Biden's legacy has being formulated to be one of utter political failure and certainly complicity in the eyes of many in his own party, to stop what is happening in Gaza, to apply enough pressure on Netanyahu to seize the Rafah offensive and to allow humanitarian assistance in.
Mr. Cadman, America's stance, tone towards Israel has certainly changed since the war on Gaza began, especially, in the last month, with Biden even saying that, withholding an arms shipment, saying that that Israel is using American weapons to kill civilians. But I wonder just how vulnerable is the International Court of Justice to political sentiment or to political influence? Are these things that the court will be considering in making its ruling?
Well, I think the first point is that as lawyers, we have to place our trust in all courts being independent and acting impartially in any matter before them. Even the International Court of Justice, which obviously is the highest court of the United Nations, we have to put our trust in that court to deliver a decision that is just and based on the evidence. And so far, that is what we have seen. We have not seen it bowing to pressure. We have seen it making very measured decisions. Of course, those of us that stand on one side want to see it doing much, much more. And we want to see it actually ordering a ceasefire and ordering Israel to withdraw all military operations out of Gaza. Of course, we want to see that. And I would like to see it give a very strong ruling in relation to this. But when we look at the pressure from other states, one of the concerns that we have is the completely irrational position that's taken by states as far as the arguments that are made in respect of Ukraine and the arguments that are made in respect of Israel, and that is worrying, of course. The change in position that we're seeing now, certainly from the United States and other European nations, is based on what we are seeing. The fact that more than 35,000 people have been killed. Now, let's say that the argument of 10,000 is correct. I don't know where that figure is plucked from, but let's say that that's correct. There's still 25,000 civilians that have been killed, many of whom are women and children that have played no part in this. And we're told that Israel has the ability to carry out targeted military operations. It is not. It is destroying Gaza. It is forcing Palestinians out. And when we talk about the warning signs, and those of us that practice in international humanitarian law know that the fact that you give a warning, an opportunity for people to leave, does not give you carte blanche to then literally bomb and destroy that area. And what we see is most of Gaza is completely destroyed, inhabitable. And then we see 700,000 civilians being forced into an area where they are, as we see, facing a famine. So I think that is what has caused the international community to change its position, because it is contributing to the situation on the ground, and they have to take responsibility.
Mr. Sabel, how is Israel concerned about the international community, as Mr. Cadman says, like changing its position? Israel is growing more isolated on the world stage. Is it concerned?
First, I also hope the court will be impartial. I hope the president of the court, who is from Lebanon, will be impartial. I hope so. And secondly, the United States completely supports Israel's aim to try and destroy the military branch of Hamas. They're not wavering. They're worried about civilian casualties, and as we are, every civilian casualty only harms Israel. We do make every effort not to kill civilians, because clearly it's a PR achievement for Hamas when civilians are killed, and they don't kill. They don't care. They haven't built shelters for their civilians. Therefore,
we've heard Hamas has said many times, but I also have to say, Hamas has said many times over and over and again since October 7th that every civilian casualty is a tragedy for them. And I don't actually know how you can say civilian casualties are a tragedy for Israel when it's killed more than 35,000 people, at least 60% of them women, children, and the elderly.
I'll tell you, it's a legitimate question. I'll tell you why. When we killed civilians, and civilians are killed in fighting and combat, it's a PR asset for Hamas. It harms us. We're aware of that. Be it humanitarian, we have no reason whatsoever to kill it. Therefore, Hamas has not moved its civilians out. It has not built shelters.
Where could it move them to? Where could it move them to, Mr. Sabel?
Just one moment. You asked a legitimate question. It built underground tunnels for its own terrorists, not for any civilians. Civilians were not, they haven't taken any efforts to build, whereas we build shelters for our civilians. Therefore, we took unprecedented efforts to prevent it. Warning, sending bombing dams, millions of phone calls to people to move out because we do not
again,
want to
the question is
civilians.
move out to where? And the United Nations has built many shelters in Gaza, most of which have been bombed by
Hamas
Israel.
hasn't built a single one.
Right,
Hamas
but the United Nations
has.
The United Nations has,
shelter.
and Israel has bombed most of them. We don't have very long left in the program. And Ms. Odeh, I'd like to come back to you with a very important point that you made earlier. I want to go back to that because Israel cannot, of course, continue this war in Gaza without the support of America, both militarily and diplomatically. We didn't see the ruling, we didn't see the hearing in January have any impact on America's support for Israel. Do you see that changing now? Or do domestic politics in America, do you see them still trumping international sentiment?
Look, I think two things are happening. On the one hand, America's policy is being isolated in Europe, which is an important ally. And so pressure is coming from there because the public opinion in Europe and many governments in Europe are moving towards a point where they are telling the Americans this policy is simply untenable. We cannot continue to support it. And this will cost us in upcoming elections. We saw that in the UK, where the position of the government did cost the ruling Tories a lot of seats. And we will see it in other places, most likely. We've seen the student encampments and so on. And so there will be pressure applied on the Biden administration from that direction, which is very significant. And there's still the domestic political aspect involved. I think Washington will be the last one standing, but it will become very difficult for European countries to continue allowing Israel to get away with it. And that's why we saw Spain not allowing a shipment of arms and munitions to even dock in its port on its way to Israel.
All right.
Countries understand that they have responsibilities. They understand that this case is at the court because diplomacy has failed and because the politicians are playing politics with the Palestinian people's blood. And that is simply an untenable policy position at this point.
Ms. Odeh, we've run out of time, but I want to thank all of our guests for today's discussion. That is Toby Cadman in London, Nour Odeh in Ramallah, and Robbie Sabel in West Jerusalem. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.